Hi, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Alex. I am Leaders National Trainer. Thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar specifically focused on the Ubiquiti Radius setup. This very much is a technical webinar, so we're going to be focusing on the technical setup side of things. It isn't so much in depth about the Radius methods themselves. There's tons of videos and stuff about that online already, and we're also going to expand on that in future. For this one, we are specifically going to be looking at how we're going to set up Radius as the most predominant method for Ubiquiti deployments. This topic, it tends to overlap into many of the other topics, so stuff like VLANs, etc. as well. So if there's anything that we don't cover in this webinar, I also encourage you guys to check out our YouTube channel, as we do cover a lot more in depth about stuff like VLANs, etc. on other videos as well. So as with any of our webinars as well, please feel free to put through any suggestions or questions that you might have. If you'd like to see us talk about different topics or expand on certain topics, please feel free to post that through. Alternatively, you can reach out to me afterwards as well on webinars@leadersystems.com.au. So for today's setup, we're going to be specifically looking at Ubiquiti's Radius Server mode. We're going to look at how we set up networks, etc. And then just important as well, our videos were recorded on a UDM Pro AC, but the setup should be very similar on most of your Ubiquiti devices. The majority of the content is pre-recorded and video-based, so if the videos don't play smoothly on your side, please do check out our YouTube channel as well afterwards. We do upload the full frame rate version of this as well online directly afterwards. With that being said, we can dive straight into it and look at the topics we'll be covering today. So first off, what we're going to do is build 5 distinct networks. So we're going to build a management network, a guest network, a corporate network, our IoT network, and a VoIP network. This, I feel, is pretty representative of what we see mostly in most of our client deployments. We're also going to look at how we segment out these networks via VLAN. Again, we don't go into VLANs in too much depth here, but if you want to expand on that, we've already done a webinar on that as well. We're going to show you the wireless LAN setup, and then of course how Radius ties into all of this and how we're going to use Radius for VLAN assignment primarily. And then we're also going to see how we set up the Radius in kind of a client mode where we have a external Radius server, something like Azure AD, etc. With that said, we're going to dive straight into it and we're going to see how we build these networks. So we're going to assume that we don't have that you don't have a network setup already. This very briefly is my topology. So I've just got a UDM Pro EC. I've got a USW Pro 24 switch. I've got my notebook connected to that via Ethernet at the moment, and then a G3 DOM and a UAP AC SHD as well. So typically the first place we're going to start when we start setting up these networks is we will start by creating bandwidth profiles. I will note something here when using bandwidth profiles with Radius. Bandwidth profiles tend not to behave in the way we expect them to when using Radius authentication. And a large part of this webinar is to show you how that can be overcome and how it actually interacts with bandwidth profiles when you're using Radius-based authentication. So as you can see, I'm literally just going to the profile section here of my UDM. I'm going to create a couple of bandwidth profiles. So the first one would be for my corporate network. So this would be for a business where you want to put all of your users into a profile with a certain restriction. In this instance, it's 25 megabit per second and 15 megabit per second up. I'm also going to create a guest network with a little bit more tightly controlled bandwidth, so 10 down and 5 up. And the last one I'm going to create here is I want to also create a IoT profile. IoT devices are becoming much more prevalent, and I think for security, it's always a good idea to apply fairly strict bandwidth profile restrictions. With the bandwidth profiles created, again, we're not going to They don't have a direct impact on radius, but we are going to use them in different parts of the radius setup. So we'll see that as we get to the next one. So next, when we're creating networks, we also need to, or next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to start creating the networks themselves. So I've already set up a corporate network here, and of course we have our default network as well. The corporate network that I've set up is just in the 10 range, so 10.0. In this instance, it would be 10.0 as the gateway. And I've also got my default network set up already. So we're going to look at how we break away from the default network and put our clients onto the correct networks respectively. So I've already used network 10, so I'm going to keep referring to it as 10, and VLAN 10 on this network as well. Through the guest and other networks that we create here, we're going to see how we reuse how we use different VLANs for those networks as well. So the one that I want to get started off with is by creating a guest network. And the place most people tend to think they need to start is by creating a network first, but actually for guests, we typically need to set up the guest hotspot as the first point. In my guest hotspot, I can choose what my authentication type is. I can obviously authenticate with other authentication methods. I'm going to use a very simple one here for our example, just a password. I'm also going to create a landing page for this. I can make this nice and pretty if I want to. I can use the Unsplash gallery there to, to pick pre-made images. I'm literally just enabling the terms of service here as well. And then important, you'll see that the hotspot already has a restricted authorization list. What we mean with that is that it will by default restrict access to the networks indicated. So specifically, we want guests not to be able to reach our internal network and, for example, hit other gateways or reach other devices in the network that they shouldn't have access to. So the next thing I'm going to do here as well is I am going to create the rest of my network. So I've already created my guest network there. Next one I'm going to set up is, as soon as it will play, sorry, the video playback isn't isn't very smooth, but essentially the next one I'm going to create is, let's keep starting from scratch. Sorry about that. So the next one I create is the IoT network, and I'm also going to create a VoIP network here as well. So the IoT network and VoIP network are primarily used for separating out, again, our IoT devices and our VoIP devices as well, which are extremely important to separate away from the rest of our devices so that we don't have a degradation of services on those. So this should actually show us the IoT setup. Okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do now is just create the IoT network. I'm going to say it's just a standard IoT network. I'm going to use my UDM as the primary gateway. I'm also going to change my address. So I'm going to set a gateway address of 10.0.30 here and .1. And essentially it's going to start broadcasting DHCP server on this network range. And I've also assigned a VLAN of 30 here. So you'll see I've got my corporate network on subnet 10. I've got my guest network on subnet 20, and then I've got my IoT network on subnet 30 as well. At the moment, I'm not really applying anything to this. All I'm doing is I'm creating the networks to separate them out. Next one I'm going to create is my VoIP network. So give it a sec here to play. So there we go. And essentially I'm doing the same thing again. VoIP network. Again, I'm not going to detick auto scale there, so I can select my IP address range that I want to use. And my VoIP network is going to be in the 40 range. And again, VLAN, I'm going to make 40 as well. You'll see I also don't change the network type, or I don't apply any filters. So for example, I don't change it to be a family network or anything like that, because that will go and apply a whole bunch of firewall rules based on the profile that I've selected. So as a final setup, this is pretty much what I end up with, where all of my subnets have been created. My connected devices currently are still on the default network, and realistically, we want to move those devices off onto other networks as well. So let's very briefly discuss Radius. I'm not going to get into depth on this. There's a ton of articles, and even from Ubiquiti side, they've done a whole bunch of videos, as well as web links and pages, etc., to specifically explain this. But in Radius, there are essentially three parts. You have your Radius server, your Radius directory, which basically lists all of the users and devices, and then you have your Radius clients. So what we're setting up on the UDM today is essentially a Radius server and Radius directory, but it's set up at the same time. It's really simplified. There's a reason that this webinar is only 30 minutes long. It's because it's super easy to create Radius servers in Ubiquiti. I will also note here that we don't talk at length about how we set up the Microsoft Active Directory integration. I'll show you very briefly how that would flow. But essentially, this is more on the Ubiquiti side as opposed to the Azure AD or AD side of things. So why do we use Radius? What is the benefit of using Radius? So the first thing is, if we don't use Radius, we typically end up using what we call a pre-shared key. Pre-shared keys for users, you would all be familiar with this, where you walk into a business, they tell you the Wi-Fi password, you write it down on a piece of paper, and essentially go sit at your desk, type it in, and that in itself represents a lot of security dangers, because firstly, you can share that password if you can remember it. Secondly, like I said, you write it down to remember it. So there's a lot of security vulnerabilities when you do it that way. With Radius Authentication, what we do is we create a unique username and password for each user. So if a breach happens, you know exactly which user leaked that username and password. The benefit of this as well is if it ties back into something like Azure Active Directory, for example, you can force that password to change at certain intervals. So you can say that this password will only be active for 30 days, and after that time, that person should renew that password to continue to make sure that that password stays secure. So you'll end up with password 1, password 123, password 123 exclamation mark, etc., etc., as the users try to protect themselves. But essentially, it forces that behavior of changing your password intermittently. The other primary reason we use it on Ubiquiti is we want to be able to take users out of the default network and put them into a specific VLAN. So each VLAN obviously functions as its own unique network. And what we're trying to do is, if you had a VLAN setup like the ones we created, where you had VLAN 40 for your VoIP devices, for example, let's say you connect up an access point to your switch, and on that access point, you go say, okay, the access point by default is going to be on VLAN 40, but that means all traffic connecting to that access point is then automatically put into VLAN 40. The way we get past that is by using radius-based authentication, where we can, based on the username and password that is entered, go into a specific VLAN. We're going to see how that works in a second as well. Like I said, you can also use an external identity provider. In this instance, they mention Azure, Google, Okta, and there's a whole bunch of them as well that you can use externally. So this is literally just skimming the surface of what Active Directory, Radius Authentication really is. But for our intents and purposes and setup, we really don't need to go into much more depth around that. So let's see how Radius works with Ubiquiti. So to start setting up Radius, all I'm going to do is go to Profiles. I am going to go use the default one that is there already. This is so that my UDM becomes a Radius server, not a Radius relay or Radius client. Essentially, I'm creating the server and I'm keeping the list of usernames here. I can also say whether this should apply to my wired and wireless networks. The most common example would probably be on your wireless network side of things. You also get the option to change the default ports if you have another Radius server set up in your environment. What I'm going to do now is just create the different usernames. So I'm going to say, firstly, this one is should be connected to the corporate network. So I'm going to call it Alex Corp, and that corporate network is on VLAN 10. I have to use very specific tunneling types here to achieve this. I have to use tunneling type 13 and 6. And basically, this is using VLAN and conical formats to create this user. And I'm going to go and create that first one. I can then go through this and create a whole bunch of extra users as well. So you typically go do this for every user in your company. In this instance, I'm going to create the guest user. Also going to enter a password for this. Again, I'm going to say, okay, my guest VLAN is VLAN 20. Same thing, 13 and 6 as my tunneling types. And then the last one I'm going to create here as well. I should be able to create one for, I think it was for the IoT network, if I'm not mistaken. No, I'm actually going to stop there. One thing I need to do as well is I need to actually create a user to authenticate as an IT person. So if I'm setting up all of my users on separate VLANs, I still want to make sure that myself as the IT person actually has access to this as well, and I'm still able to reach both the console, and I'm able to reach the rest of my network so that I can apply configuration changes. So I'm literally just going to create a user here called Alex IT. I'm going to just give it the same password. And instead of assigning a VLAN, I'm just going to leave it as 0, which will mean it dumps me into the default network by default. And it's going to go, it's the same thing, still 13 and 6 here. I don't need to use a special format. It's exactly the same. So now I've created the user, and essentially I now have a user to authenticate with as a corporate user, a guest user, and my IT user as well. So now that that's done, I can essentially start setting up my Wi-Fi. I have two options here, and this is the most important part to consider. So the first option when I'm creating my Wi-Fi networks is whether I want to create one SSID for the entire company and let Radius decide on what network those users should go, which is typically the preferred way to do it. The second one is where I create a separate SSID for the different networks. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of those. One thing that we'll pick up as we go along the way here is how it handles bandwidth profiles that we created earlier. So let's see how we actually do this. Again, I'm going to Wi-Fi. I'm actually just going to call my first one my company-wide Wi-Fi, or I'm just going to call it company X Wi-Fi, whichever works. So here I'm deciding, do I want to have one specific for my corporate network, or do I want one as a company-wide one? So I'll say company X Wi-Fi, and this is essentially going to be the same Wi-Fi for all of my clients, regardless of what their type is. The network type when I'm using Radius here doesn't really matter. I'm going to leave that as default. What I'm going to do now is I need to say what the bandwidth profiles is. Because again, I'm using one Wi-Fi for everything, I'm going to leave that on default as well. Important, the security protocol has to be WPA2 Enterprise. WPA2 PSK does not work with Radius authentication. What I can do now is I can jump onto that Wi-Fi that I've created. I need to enter that username and password that I set up in the Radius profiles. I'm going to log in with my corporate account first. I'm just going to go OK, connect. And in a few seconds, it should allow me to connect back up to my UDM. And as soon as that's done, we should see that I am now in a separate network. So basically, I connected to one SSID, but dependent on the credentials that I've entered, it's put me into a specific network. So it's now said that my network is my corporate network. And one thing I'll do here is my corporate network is limited to 25 megabit per second, but if I do a speed test, I'm not getting limited to 25 megabit per second. So we can we can do a takeaway from this and say, the reason for that is because we don't have a bandwidth profile applied. So the corporate network there, as you can see, it's the bandwidth profile is created, but it is not applying to this user account. And the reason for that is because that bandwidth profile is assigned to the wireless LAN ID or the wireless LAN that you've created, that SSID that you set up. So essentially, if I use Radius Authentication and I have a bunch of users that should get separate bandwidth profiles, there's no real neat way right now for it to select the correct VLAN and bandwidth profile. Primarily right now, it's used for putting you onto the correct network only. So one thing to also take note here is that inter-VLAN blocking is not enabled by default. This is something that you have to set up on the firewall side of things. And I can test this if I look, for example, at my laptop, which is connected to my network, and I can start, I'll just do a quick IP config to see what my IP address is. So that's the gateway that I'm connecting to. When I do a ping test, I can obviously reach the gateway that I'm on. But one thing that I can do here as well is I can actually hit the primary gateway, 0.1. If I had inter-VLAN blocking enabled, I wouldn't be able to hit that. So it means inter-VLAN blocking isn't on by disabled, by default, I mean. If you go to the video recording that we did for the VLAN webinar, you'll see how to actually set up that inter-VLAN blocking. It's just a couple of firewall rules. In a real network, you would probably want to make it so that guests cannot access your corporate network and vice versa. And your IoT devices are typically segmented off as well. So if you want to go check this video out, it's on our Leader Academy YouTube channel as well. It's literally just at Leader Academy AU, and you'll see that very first link on there, the VLAN video is the one I was referring to. So we do talk about that in depth as well. So let's test the guest networks. I've created 2 users. So I've set up a corporate user and a guest user. Both of them are still connecting to one SSID. And if I go test this, I am now going to switch over to my, again, the same SSID, but I'm just going to use a different username and password. So instead of using Alex Corporate, I'm just going to use Alex Guest. And I'm going to use the password again and click OK. As soon as I do this, it will dump me into the guest network. And because I have hotspot set up, you'll see it comes up with the hotspot. And I need to actually enter a username and password here, which means that Radius Authentication is functioning like it should. It's directing the users onto the networks that they should be on. So I'm just going to say connect. And as soon as that's done, it's going to redirect me to a default page. This is all set up in the guest profile as well. I've also connected another device here, my cell phone, just so we can test this. And you'll see the one is on 10.0.20.120, and the other one is on 147, if I'm not mistaken. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm on the guest network, so I want to test if I can reach any other parts of the network. So I'm trying to reach the gateway here, 20.1. I can't. I am also trying to see if I can hit any of the other gateways, like 1.1 or 0.1 or pretty much anything else in this network. Because it's directing me onto the guest network and I've got that guest button enabled, it's stopping me from reaching the rest of the network. One thing to note here is when I set this up, I didn't enable client isolation. So if I try to reach my cell phone from my laptop, like I'm doing right now, 147, I can still reach it. The way I would disable this or stop this from happening again is I would actually go to settings. It's very easy. Go to my Wi-Fi network that I've created. There's just an option that says client device isolation. It just means 2 clients on the same network cannot reach each other. With that applied, you'll see as soon as I do a ping test here, essentially the 2 clients cannot reach each other. So all that guest mode option does is it enables a bunch of firewall rules by default so that you cannot reach the gateway, you cannot reach any gateways outside of your own gateway, and typically you cannot reach any of the other client devices on your network, which is exactly what we want. One thing to take away from this as well is even though I am on the guest network, I am still going past the limitations imposed. I'm only supposed to be hitting 10 megabit per second here, but we can see I'm exceeding that. And again, this is because the bandwidth profile is applied to that SSID, and right now it's on default. So if I have one SSID for the entire company, it means it's not going to take that bandwidth profile into account. So how do we get past this? How do we set bandwidth profiles on each one of these devices? Well, the first one is to actually do it individually on each device. This can be a bit tedious, especially if you have hundreds of devices. So you'll see here that what I can do is I can go onto my laptop. I can say defer this to a bandwidth profile. And in this instance, I'll make it guest network so that it applies that 10 megabit per second limitation. I can also set fixed IPs and lock it to an access point if I want to, but really the primary thing here is I just want to apply the bandwidth profile. As soon as that is done, I am going to do a very quick speed test here, and you'll see I should be restricted to 10 megabit per second. That being said, it's not always exactly 10 megabit per second. It will be slightly lower. Typically, it's about, I would say about 10% lower than what we've set. So there's something to take into consideration when you're doing speed tests. So you'll see it takes a while to get up there, but essentially it's applying that limit and saying that this user cannot reach more than 10 megabit per second. So with that speed test done, you'll see the upload's a little bit faster. And again, the blocking here is coming from the UDM side, so it's not really blocking from anywhere else. It's literally that blocking occurs on the UDM Pro EC itself. So that's per client, but if you have hundreds of clients, that's obviously slow. So how do we get past this where we don't have, or we don't want to go through each client individually? The way to do this is through traffic management. So before I do this, you'll see, again, my notebook's connected up directly. I don't have a profile applied. So what I can do is I can go into traffic management on the UDM, go create a new rule, and I can apply a speed limit rule. And in the speed limits here, I want to select app group, and I'm just going to say all apps. And now I can say what my speed is, how fast I want this to be able to go, and which network it should apply to. So right now I can say, okay, I want it to be 1 megabit per second and apply to the guest network only. As soon as that's done, every guest that is connected to this guest network will essentially be limited to 1 megabit per second. So you'll see it's slightly lower than that, so it gets up to, I think, 0.9 megabit per second or something like that. So it is applying that rate limit. Just one thing to note, when you're creating rules like this, it does impact your CPU performance as well. So I would keep an eye on that. You can make this more granular as well by only applying speed limits to certain applications. So for example, YouTube or something like that. And of course, I can apply this individually to devices as well. But really, if you're doing this in bulk, you would probably want to apply this to the entire network. So now we can take a different approach. So that was the ones we looked at up to now is where we've had a single SSID, but with multiple radius clients. Now we can take a different approach. We can go, we want to have multiple SSIDs and still use different radius clients. This, though, is a bad idea in terms of spectral efficiency. And what we mean by that is, wherever possible, you should always try to have as few SSIDs as possible. If you don't use bandwidth restrictions, then really this isn't, or you wouldn't be too bothered by how you set up your network previously. Essentially, you would just have all of your users jump into the network via radius. If you do use bandwidth profiles, though, this is a nice way to get around the limitations that we have. So with this, I'm creating a new bandwidth profile, new SSID, I mean. I'm just going to call it corporate Wi-Fi. I'm going to assign it to my corporate network, and my bandwidth profile I'm going to assign is my corporate network bandwidth profile as well. Still, I'm using WPA2 Enterprise, and I'm using Radius. So I'm going to go apply this. And if I then go create a guest network, I will essentially do the same thing, but just put it onto the guest network, and I'm going to say guest bandwidth profile as well. I will also say the guest, the SSID type is a guest hotspot, so that it applies the correct restrictions to that. You'll see I select WPA2 Enterprise, add it, and really what I can do now is I can jump onto these networks and I can see the performance of those. I'm taking a third step here and also creating an IoT network. And this is just for my bad IoT devices. I like to segment them out from the rest of my network so that they don't have the potential to interfere with it, and potentially for threat management as well. Your IoT devices don't typically have Radius authentication, so you'll see I didn't enable Radius there. What I'm going to do now is you'll see the corporate Wi-Fi is there, the guest Wi-Fi is there, and the IoT network is there. And I'm just going to sign in with the same usernames and passwords that I set up in Radius previously. I'm going to go connect. And now, firstly, it's going to automatically apply the correct rate limits because I'm jumping onto that specific SSID, and it's putting me into the correct network as well by default. So Radius and the network selected, they are kind of duplicating the same thing, but you'll see the speed limit is inherently applied. So it's going slightly over what it's meant to. There we go, 20 megabits per second, that's it. So it's applying the rate limit as it's supposed to. If I go jump onto the guest Wi-Fi now, knowing that it's supposed to hit 10 megabits per second, we will see that it authorizes, perfect, and that rate limit gets applied correctly as expected as well. So again, it's not breaching beyond 10 megabits per second. So it's a good way to apply the correct bandwidth profiles by default, depending on the network that you connect to. Finally, let's take a look at what we need to do if we want to use an external Radius server or identity provider. Really, this is 2 seconds on the slide, because all we need to do is we can leave the default one in place or pause it if we want to. In this instance, I'm just pausing that default Radius server, and now I'm creating a second profile. It doesn't want to pause it because I've got some firewall rules set up. But now I can say, for example, this is my M365 Azure Active Directory integration. I'm going to apply this to my wireless network. And now all I need to do is just say what the address is of the Radius servers that I'm trying to hit. I can say whether accounting needs to be enabled or whether that server handles accounting as well. And I can also set the update interval. By doing this, it means that Azure Active Directory or Active Directory is handling the authentication part, and it's just passing through the approval or denial based on the credentials that that user enters. We use this here at Leader as well. All of our users are tied to Active Directory. So you sign in with the same username, same password that you use for your emails, and you sign into your Wi-Fi with those credentials. And as you update your password, your accounts or your Wi-Fi password is obviously updated to be the same as well. Really, this is a very quick overview of this. I see a couple of questions coming through. I'm going to answer them in a second. If you guys have any further questions around this, please feel free to post them through now. We also do extensive training on including this topic as well as other indoor and outdoor wireless topics. Please do feel free to hit us up on leaderacademy.com.au. As you can see, the training dates indicated on screen. We have a ton of other webinars coming up as well, so please feel free to register for any of the technical webinars coming up in the future. And again, that address is leaderacademy.com.au.